The text message lit up my phone at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, casting an eerie blue glow across my dark bedroom. Reservation confirmed. Lakeside Cabin Number 7, Twin Pines Resort, May 15, 22. I stared at the notification, confusion quickly giving way to dread as I realized May 15th was our anniversary. But Robert and I had been planning a trip to Cancun, not some cabin in the mountains. My hands trembled as I opened the message, my breath catching in my throat as I read, "Special requests noted. Champagne on arrival, rose petals on bed. Couples massage for Robert Williams and Natalie Carson." Natalie Carson, his 29-year-old marketing director. My husband of 12 years was taking his mistress to a romantic cabin getaway on our anniversary. I felt the world tilt beneath me as I sat alone in our king-sized bed, the same bed where Robert had kissed me goodbye that morning, promising to be home for dinner before calling hours later to say he had to work late, again. The fourth, late night this week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emily Williams, and until that moment, I thought I had a perfect life with my perfect husband. We lived in a beautiful colonial in an upscale Boston suburb, traveled to exotic destinations twice a year, and hosted dinner parties that our friends raved about for weeks afterward. Robert ran his own marketing firm, which had grown from a scrappy startup to a respected agency with clients across New England. I supported him every step of the way, attending client dinners, proofreading, proposals late into the night, and being the perfect corporate wife when the situation called for it. In that moment, as the confirmation message glowed accusingly on my screen, a strange calm washed over me. Perhaps I'd suspected something all along, but had been too afraid to acknowledge it. The distance between us these past months, the sudden business trips, the new cologne I didn't recognize on his shirts, the way he'd stopped sharing details about his workday. I scrolled through my emails, searching for anything related to Twin Pines Resort. There it was, a message I'd missed from 2 days ago. "Mr. Williams has added a guest to your reservation. Please confirm these changes." I opened it and found something else. An email chain Robert had accidentally forwarded to me instead. Of his friend Dave. "Natalie's excited about our private getaway. She has no idea about your frigid wife. Her trust fund must be good for something." Frigid wife. Trust fund. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The casual cruelty of his words knocked the air from my lungs. After 12 years of marriage, was this how he saw me? As nothing more than a frigid woman with a convenient trust fund? The irony was almost laughable, if it wasn't so painful. What Robert didn't know, what I had never told him, was that my trust fund was actually controlling interest in Westlake Properties, my family's real estate development company. The small inheritance I'd mentioned when we first met 12 years ago was actually a portfolio worth millions, including several vacation property chains. Twin Pines Resort was one of them. I'd kept my wealth and position quiet when we met because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my money. After watching 3 boyfriends transition from romantic partners to financial advisors once they learned my family name, I'd grown cautious. Robert had seemed refreshingly uninterested in my background, a self-made man who'd built his marketing firm from nothing. I admired his ambition and fell for his charm. After we married, I continued managing my family's business interests, but kept them separate from our marriage. I attended quarterly board meetings while Robert thought I was at charity luncheons. I reviewed financial reports from my home office while he believed I was managing my modest inheritance. I'd even used my maiden name, Emily Sullivan, in professional settings to keep my worlds separate. It wasn't that I deliberately kept secrets. I'd considered telling him everything many times, but the moment never seemed right. As his business grew, so did his ego, and I worried that knowledge of my true financial status might create an imbalance. I didn't want to diminish his accomplishments or make him feel like his success was somehow less significant than mine. Now, that decision felt foolish. I had protected his pride while he betrayed my trust. I didn't call him. I didn't throw his clothes on the lawn or change the locks. I didn't drive to his office downtown where he was probably still working late with Natalie. Instead, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen island thinking. The granite countertop felt cool beneath my fingertips as I traced random patterns, organizing my thoughts. This wasn't just about infidelity. The calculated way he'd planned this, the contempt in his message, it spoke to something deeper, more fundamental about how he saw me. By morning, I had a plan forming in my mind. The sky was just beginning to lighten, shifting from black to deep blue when I finally went to my home office and locked the door behind me. This room, with its elegant built-in bookshelves and comfortable leather chair, was my sanctuary. Robert rarely entered, respecting it as Emily's space for managing what he believed was my modest portfolio. If only he knew that from this room, I helped direct a company that owned properties worth billions. I called my assistant at Westlake Properties, making sure to use the private line Robert didn't know existed. "Jessica, I need you to clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks." "Everything? Even the Seattle development meeting?" Her voice held a note of concern. Jessica had been with me for 8 years and knew I never missed important meetings. "Everything, personal emergency." "Is everything okay, Emily?" "No," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "But it will. But I also need information on a reservation at Twin Pines, Cabin 7, May 15th through 22nd, under Robert Williams. And Jessica, I need absolute discretion on this." After hanging up, I called my longtime attorney, Michael Greenfield, who had handled the Sullivan family's legal matters for decades. "I need divorce papers prepared," I told him without preamble, "and I need them ready by next week." "Emily, are you sure? You and Robert have been together for—" "Robert is having an affair with his marketing director and taking her to Twin Pines on our anniversary." Michael was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry. I'll get started right away. But Emily, given your position and assets, we need to be careful about how we approach this. Robert signed a prenup, but if he discovers the full extent of your holdings before we file—" "He won't," I assured him. "Not until I'm ready." I spent the next hour making calls, setting my plan in motion. By the time I heard Robert's key in the front door at 6:37 a.m., I had already showered and dressed in a casual outfit that revealed nothing of my sleepless night or the storm of emotions raging within me. "Hey," he said, looking surprised to find me in the kitchen. "You're up early." I offered him a gentle smile, one I'd perfected over years of business negotiations. "Couldn't sleep. Coffee?" "God, yes." He loosened his tie and set his briefcase on the counter. "The Morrison campaign is a nightmare. We were at the office until 2 working on the pitch." The lie fell from his lips so easily, so convincingly that for a brief, disorienting moment, I almost doubted what I knew to be true. Almost. "You poor thing," I said, pouring him a cup from the fresh pot I'd made. "You've been working so hard lately." I studied him as I handed him the coffee. Robert Williams, 45. The picture of success in his tailored shirt and designer watch. His dark hair was just beginning to gray at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. His face showed signs of fatigue, with slight shadows under his eyes, but he was still handsome enough to turn heads when we went out. We had met at a gallery opening where I was representing the Sullivan Family Foundation, which funded arts education programs. I had introduced myself simply as Emily Sullivan, Foundation board member, not Emily Sullivan, heiress to the Westlake fortune. Robert was there hunting for new clients, though he presented himself as an art enthusiast. Perhaps our relationship had been built on half-truths from the very beginning. "What's on your agenda today?" he asked, scrolling through emails on his phone. "Just the usual," I replied. "Lunch with Karen, then the hospital foundation meeting." I paused, watching him carefully. "And I need to finalize some details for our anniversary trip next month." His fingers paused imperceptibly over his phone screen before he continued scrolling. "About that," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I might need to reschedule. The Morrison acquisition is at a critical stage, and I don't think I can get away at that time." I marveled at his performance. The regretful tone, the furrowed brow of a husband disappointed to postpone a special occasion. There was no hint that he had already booked a romantic getaway with his mistress for those exact dates. "That's a shame," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I was really looking forward to it." "I know, and I'm sorry," he said, his expression a perfect mask of contrition. "I'll make it up to you, I promise. Maybe we can go in the fall instead." I nodded, thinking about the quarterly board meetings I'd be leading at Westlake in the fall, decisions I'd be making that would affect thousands of employees, including those at Twin Pines Resort, all while Robert believed I was simply managing my modest inheritance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maybe. I took a sip of my coffee, using the mug to hide my expression. "Will you be home for dinner tonight?" He hesitated, and I could almost see the calculation behind his eyes. "I should be, unless the Morrison team needs me to stay late. Again." "Of course," I said. "Your clients come first. I understand." He finished his coffee and stood up. "I should grab a shower and change before my 9 o'clock. "Of course." He leaned down to kiss my cheek, and I forced myself not to flinch at his touch. His cologne mingled with another scent, something floral and distinctly feminine. Natalie's perfume. "I'll try not to wake you if I'm late," he promised as he headed toward our bedroom. I waited until I heard the shower running before I pulled out my phone and sent a text to Jessica. "Operation Twin Pines is a go. I need everything we discussed by noon." Over the next 24 hours, I assembled my team. Beyond Jessica and Michael, I brought in Daniel Chen, head of security for Westlake Properties, and my closest friend since college, Olivia Martinez, who happened to be a PR specialist. In my home office, a room Robert rarely entered, we gathered around my conference table while Robert was supposedly at a client dinner. "Our investigation into Natalie Carson shows this isn't just a simple affair," Daniel reported, pulling up files on his tablet. "She's been in contact with representatives from Meridian Development for months." I frowned. Meridian was our biggest competitor, constantly trying to acquire our properties and poach our staff. "She's feeding them information about potential Westlake acquisitions," Daniel continued. "Information she could only have gotten from someone with inside access to your company." "Robert," I said, the pieces falling into place. "All those questions about my day, about properties we own. I thought he was just taking an interest." Olivia squeezed my hand. "He's been using you, Em." "And that's not all," Daniel said, his expression grim. "We've found financial irregularities. Robert has been transferring funds from your joint accounts to an offshore company. Nearly $5 million over the past 2 years." "What?" The betrayal cut deeper with each revelation. "The company is registered to Robert and someone named Sandra Williams." "I don't know any Sandra Williams." "That's because she doesn't exist in Robert's life," Daniel explained. "She's his sister. She's been living in Arizona for the past decade, apparently estranged until recently. In 12 years of marriage, Robert had never once mentioned having a sister. She claims Robert cut her out of their parents' inheritance years ago through some questionable legal maneuvering," Jessica added. "She's agreed to help us." She's quite bitter about what he did to her. I took a deep breath, processing this cascade of betrayals. So Robert isn't just cheating on me. He's stealing from me, using me to gather competitive intelligence for his mistress, who's feeding it to our biggest competitor, and he has a secret sister he defrauded and never told me about. That about sums it up, Michael said dryly. What do you want to do, Emily? Olivia asked, her PR instincts clearly calculating how to minimize the potential scandal. I looked at the faces of my most trusted advisors, people who knew the real me, not just the careful construct I'd created for Robert's benefit. I want justice, I said finally. Not just for me, but for Sandra, for Westlake, for everyone Robert has deceived and used. I turned to Jessica. Book me a cabin at Twin Pines, the executive cabin on the North Shore. I'm going to be there when they arrive. You're going to confront him? Olivia asked carefully. I smiled, a plan crystallizing in my mind. I'm going to do much more than that. I'm going to show him exactly who I am and what he's lost. 3 days later, I was on my way to Twin Pines Resort in the Catskills, a 5-hour drive from our home in Boston. As I navigated the winding mountain roads, the dense forest of pine and birch creating a tunnel of green and white on either side, I felt a strange sense of purpose replacing the initial pain. Twin Pines was one of Westlake's most successful properties, a luxury resort with 30 private cabins scattered around a pristine lake, each with its own dock and breathtaking views of the mountains. The resort also included a main lodge with gourmet dining, a spa, and various amenities that catered to an exclusive clientele seeking both luxury and privacy. I'd visited several times for business, but had never brought Robert, maintaining the separation between my professional and personal lives. Now those worlds were about to collide in a way I had never anticipated. I'd called ahead to Marcus Bennett, the general manager, informing him of my arrival, but requesting that my presence be kept confidential. To most of the staff, I would simply be Ms. Sullivan, a valued guest staying in the executive cabin on the North Shore, the most private accommodation, situated on its own small peninsula with panoramic views of the lake and mountains. As I pulled up to the main lodge, a rustic yet elegant building of stone and timber, Marcus was waiting for me on the steps. In his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the polished manner of someone who had spent his career in luxury hospitality, Marcus had been with Westlake for over 15 years. He was one of the few people who knew both sides of my life, Emily Sullivan, the CEO, and Emily Williams, the Boston socialite. Ms. Sullivan, he greeted me with a formal handshake, though his eyes conveyed concern. Everything has been arranged, as you requested. Thank you, Marcus. And the special preparations for Cabin 7? All in place. The staff assigned to Mr. Williams and Ms. Carson have been selected for their discretion. The security upgrades have been installed, and the special accommodations for your event are ready. I nodded, satisfaction mixing with anticipation. Perfect. The executive cabin exceeded even my memories. A stunning 3,000-square-foot retreat of natural wood and stone, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the breathtaking landscape. The great room featured a soaring cathedral ceiling, a massive stone fireplace, and comfortable furnishings in warm earth tones. The kitchen was fully equipped with high-end appliances, perfect for the private chef who would be preparing my meals during my stay. The master suite included a king-sized bed positioned to capture the morning light, a spa-like bathroom with a deep soaking tub, and a private deck overlooking the water. But it wasn't the luxury that impressed me as I settled. It was the sense of peace that permeated the space. Here, surrounded by nature's grandeur, the petty betrayals of human relationships seemed somehow smaller, more manageable. The next 2 days were spent in careful preparation. From my executive cabin, with its panoramic views of the lake, I coordinated the final details of what I had come to think of as Operation Homecoming. Twin Pines' security team, under Daniel's direction, had installed state-of-the-art surveillance in Cabin 7. Every conversation would be recorded, every movement monitored. They'd also increased security throughout the resort, ensuring no unauthorized media could access the property once events were set in motion. I arranged for special staff to service the cabin, all longtime Westlake employees who understood the sensitivity of the situation and had signed enhanced confidentiality agreements. Most importantly, I prepared the physical evidence I would need for the confrontation. Westlake's financial records showing my ownership of Twin Pines and several other vacation properties, board meeting minutes with my signature as CEO, recent press coverage of Westlake's expansion plans, and the Sullivan family signet ring, traditionally worn by the head of the company. On May 14th, the day before Robert and Natalie were due to arrive, I received confirmation from Jessica that everything was in place back in Boston as well. The forensic accountants had traced the money Robert had diverted. The legal team had documentation of Natalie's communications with Meridian Development, and most surprisingly, they'd established contact with Sandra Williams, Robert's estranged sister. She was eager to help once she understood the situation, Jessica reported over the phone. Apparently, Robert cut her out of their parents' inheritance years ago through some creative interpretation of their will. She's flying in tomorrow morning. I smiled. Have her brought directly to the resort. I want her settled in Cabin 9 before Robert and Natalie arrive. That evening, I walked along the lakeshore, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. The air was cool and pine-scented, filled with the gentle sounds of nature. Birds calling to each other as they settled for the night. The soft lapping of water against the shore, the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. Tomorrow, Robert and Natalie would arrive, expecting a romantic getaway. Instead, they'd find themselves walking into a carefully orchestrated reckoning that would expose every lie, every betrayal, every manipulation. As I watched the fading light reflect off the still waters of the lake, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For years, I had lived a double life. Powerful businesswoman by day, supportive wife by night. I had diminished myself for Robert's ego, hidden my accomplishments to protect his pride. No more. It was time for Catherine Meridian to step fully into the light and for Robert to discover that he had never really known the woman he had married at all. At precisely 3:45 p.m. on May 15th, our wedding anniversary, I received word from security that Robert and Natalie had checked in and were being escorted to Cabin 7. From my position on the deck of the resort's lakeside restaurant, I could see their arrival. Robert looked just as handsome as ever in casual designer clothes that I'd probably paid for without him realizing it. Natalie was beside him, tall and slender in a flowing sundress, her arm linked with his as they laughed at something the porter said. The casual intimacy between them sent a sharp pain through my chest, but I pushed it aside. Today wasn't about pain. It was about truth. I waited 30 minutes, giving them time to settle in before setting my plan in motion. According to the cabin's surveillance, they had already opened champagne and were exploring the romantic touches Robert had requested. I made my way to the private dock where guests could rent boats, nodding to the attendant who had been briefed on my arrival. "The canoe is ready, Ms. Sullivan," he said, gesturing to a sleek wooden vessel already in the water. I thanked him and stepped in, paddling leisurely toward the center of the lake. From there, I had a perfect view of Cabin 7's private dock, where, right on schedule, Robert and Natalie emerged to enjoy the late afternoon sun. I directed my canoe toward their dock, making it appear as though I was simply a guest enjoying the lake. As I drew closer, I saw the exact moment when Robert spotted me, his body going rigid, his hand freezing around his wine glass. "Emily?" His voice carried across the water, disbelief evident in every syllable. I paddled up to their dock, smiling pleasantly as if this encounter was the most natural thing in the world. "Robert! What a surprise!" My voice carried across the water with a lightness that belied the storm brewing inside me. The color drained from Robert's face as he helped me tie up the canoe and step onto the dock. I noticed his hands were trembling. Slightly, a tell he'd always had when caught off guard. Natalie stood frozen behind him, her wineglass clutched tightly in manicured fingers, her expression cycling rapidly through confusion, recognition, and thinly veiled panic. "What are you doing here?" Robert managed to ask, his voice pitched, slightly higher than normal. "Just needed some time away to think," I said, my tone light and conversational. "This is one of my favorite spots. The lake is so peaceful, don't you think?" I turned to Natalie, extending my hand. "And you must be Natalie. Robert has mentioned what a valuable addition you've been to the company." She hesitated before taking my hand, her palm clammy against mine. "Yes, that's right. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Williams." "Please call me Emily," I said, noticing how Robert winced at the familiarity I was encouraging. "Are you enjoying Twin Pines so far?" "It's beautiful," she replied cautiously, her eyes darting between Robert and me. "We're here for a marketing retreat. Several colleagues will be joining us tomorrow." I raised an eyebrow at the lie, impressed by her quick thinking, even as I noted how seamlessly she stepped into deception. "How interesting. Which clients? Are you working with that required such an exclusive setting?" Robert cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "It's the Morrison campaign. We needed somewhere quiet, away from distractions." "Of course," I nodded, as if this explained everything. "Well, don't let me interrupt your creative process. I just wanted to say hello when I recognized you." I glanced around their deck, taking in the bottle of Dom Perignon chilling in an ice bucket, the platter of chocolate-covered strawberries, the scattered rose petals leading toward the cabin's interior. Quite the inspirational atmosphere you've created. The Morrison team must be very important clients. Robert shifted uncomfortably, unconsciously moving to block my view of the romantic setup. "They're our biggest account right now. Listen, Emily, this is a bit awkward. How long will you be staying?" "Oh, through the weekend at least," I replied breezily. I watched his face fall as he calculated the implications of my presence. "In fact," I added, as if the thought had just occurred to me, "the resort is hosting a special dinner tonight for guests staying in the premium cabins. You should come. I heard the executive chef is preparing something extraordinary." "We had planned a quiet evening," Robert began, clearly desperate to avoid spending more time in my presence. "We'd love to," Natalie interrupted, placing a hand on Robert's arm. Her eyes conveyed a silent message. Refusing would only make things more suspicious. "Wouldn't we, Robert?" He looked like he wanted to sink into the dock boards. "Of course," he said through a tight smile. "Wonderful. 8 o'clock at the Pine Room," I said, sliding back into my canoe with a grace I'd perfected through years of sailing at my family's summer home in Maine. "See you then." As I paddled away, I could hear their urgent whispers growing more heated. I didn't need the surveillance equipment Daniel had installed to know they were arguing about my unexpected appearance and what it might mean. The first phase of my plan had gone perfectly. They were off balance, uncertain, and now committed to attending a dinner where the next act of my carefully orchestrated revelation would unfold. I returned to my cabin to prepare for the evening, selecting a simple but elegant black dress that accentuated my figure without appearing as though I was trying too hard. I paired it with pearls that had been in the Sullivan family for generations, and subtle makeup that highlighted my features while conveying composed sophistication. My hair I wore in loose waves that framed my face, bringing out hints of gold that Robert had always complimented. The Sullivan signet ring went on my right hand, an understated gold band with our family crest that few would recognize unless they moved in the highest circles of real estate development. To Robert, it would appear to be just another piece of jewelry. To those who knew, it was a clear statement of my true identity and authority. By 7:45 that evening, the Pine Room had been transformed from its usual rustic elegance into something truly spectacular. Marcus had outdone himself, following my specifications to the letter. A single round table was set for 8 guests, positioned on a slightly raised platform in the center of the room. Crystal glasses caught the light from the antler chandeliers overhead, and arrangements of local wildflowers created a deceptively natural centerpiece. The other dining tables were positioned to have a clear view of our central table while maintaining the illusion of privacy. Every detail had been meticulously arranged for maximum impact, from the lighting that would highlight each guest's expressions to the strategic placement of security personnel disguised as waitstaff, ready to intervene, if necessary. I arrived first, chatting with Marcus as other guests began to arrive. The Takahashis, a dignified Japanese couple celebrating their anniversary, and Evan Chen, a tech CEO who was a regular visitor to Twin Pines and, coincidentally, one of Westlake's most significant investors. They had been carefully selected and briefed on the situation, having graciously agreed to play their parts in the evening's drama. At exactly 8:05, Robert and Natalie entered the Pine Room. He looked tense in a navy blazer that I recognized as a birthday gift from me, while she had changed into a red dress that was both sophisticated and provocative. Their eyes scanned the room, landing on me as Marcus approached to escort them to our table. "Mr. Williams, Miss Carson, welcome," Marcus said with practiced deference. "We're honored to have you join our special dinner this evening." I rose as they approached, offering a warm smile. "Robert, Natalie, I'm so glad you could make it." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly at my use of Natalie's first name, clearly wondering how much I knew. They took their assigned seats. Robert directly across from me, Natalie to his right. "I took the liberty of ordering champagne," I said as a server appeared with a bottle. "Dom Perignon 2008. Your favorite, isn't it, Robert?" His hand tightened around his water glass. "You remembered." "Of course. We had it at our wedding and on our 5th anniversary, and I believe you ordered it for your cabin yesterday." Natalie shifted uncomfortably, finally understanding that this coincidental meeting was anything but. Robert shot her a warning glance before attempting to redirect the conversation. "You mentioned you're here to think," he said, his voice carefully modulated. "Is everything all right?" "Just some business decisions I've been contemplating," I replied, accepting a glass of champagne from the server. "Actually, I've been considering some significant changes to our portfolio, which reminds me." I turned to Natalie with a friendly smile. "Robert mentioned you have a background in corporate communications. What are your thoughts on luxury property development? Growing market or too volatile?" Natalie blinked, caught off guard by my direct question. I think there's always a market for luxury, especially in unique locations. Like the Catskills, I noted, or Aspen, or Nantucket. Properties that offer an exclusive experience. "Exactly," she agreed, seeming relieved to find steady ground in the conversation. "Interesting you should mention those specific locations," I continued. "I was just looking at some Westlake Properties reports that mentioned their developments in those areas." The color drained from Natalie's face, and I saw recognition flicker in her eyes. Robert quickly intervened. "Emily doesn't follow real estate development," he told Natalie with a forced laugh. "Her interests are more in the charitable sector." "Oh, don't sell me short, darling," I chided gently. "I do try to stay informed about investments. Speaking of which," I turned back to Robert, "I was talking with Michael Greenfield yesterday. He mentioned something about irregularities in our joint accounts. Have you noticed anything unusual?" Robert's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Michael, your attorney. Why would he be looking at our accounts?" "Just the usual quarterly review," I said, my tone light. "But he seemed concerned about some transfers to an offshore holding company." I pretended to search my memory. "Something called Williams Family Investments. Does that sound familiar?" Robert's composure slipped, his hand trembling enough to clink his spoon against the rim of his soup bowl. "I think that's a conversation best had in private, Emily." "Perhaps you're right," I conceded, though my eyes conveyed that I was far from finished. "We should focus on enjoying this lovely dinner. The chef here is extraordinary. He trained in Paris before deciding he preferred the quieter life of the mountains." Before Robert could respond, Marcus returned with our final guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Sandra Williams." Robert's face drained of color as a woman in her mid-40s approached our table. She resembled Robert around the eyes and jawline, with the same confident stride I'd always admired in my husband. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant updo, and she wore a green dress that complemented her eyes currently fixed on Robert with undisguised contempt. "Sandra." Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "Hello, brother," she replied, taking the empty seat next to me. "It's been a long time." The silence that followed was absolute, a perfect vacuum of sound that seemed to stretch for an eternity. I could almost hear the gears turning in Robert's mind as he struggled to process Sandra's appearance and calculate its implications. "Natalie?" broke the tension, looking between Robert and Sandra with genuine confusion. "You never mentioned you had a sister." "There's quite a bit Robert hasn't mentioned," Sandra replied, her voice cool and controlled. "To any of us, it seems." The first course arrived, a delicate amuse-bouche of seared scallop with local herbs. The presentation was exquisite, though I doubted anyone at our table was paying much attention to the culinary artistry. "What are you doing here, Sandra?" Robert finally asked, his voice low with barely controlled panic. "Emily invited me," she said simply, gesturing to me. When she explained the situation, I couldn't resist the opportunity to see you again, after all these years. "The situation?" Robert echoed, his eyes darting to me. "Yes, Robert," I said calmly. "Sandra and I have had several illuminating conversations over the past few days. About your parents' will, for instance. About how you altered the documents to cut her out of her inheritance. About how you've been using her name for your offshore accounts." The Takahashis and Evan Chen exchanged glances, clearly fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. To their credit, they maintained their roles perfectly, expressing just the right level of polite interest mixed with discomfort. "This is absurd," Robert sputtered, his composure cracking. "Emily, if you have concerns about our marriage, we should discuss them privately, not create a scene." "Oh, I'm not creating a scene," I assured him. "The scene is just beginning." I nodded to Marcus, who approached our table with a tablet. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with dinner, we have a special announcement. Tonight we're honored to have the owner of Twin Pines Resort dining with us." All eyes turned to me expectantly. "Oh, I'm not the owner," I said, watching relief flash across Robert's face. "At least, not just me." Marcus continued, "Please, join me in welcoming the CEO of Westlake Properties, Ms. Emily Sullivan." Robert froze, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "Emily Sullivan?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. "What is he talking about?" I smiled, feeling a strange lightness as the weight of years of deception finally lifted from my shoulders. "Emily Sullivan Williams," I clarified. "I kept my professional name separate from our marriage. Surely you understand the value of compartmentalizing one's life, Robert." I signaled to Marcus, who placed a folder before me. I removed several documents, spreading them on the table where Robert could clearly see them. My business cards, identifying me as CEO of Westlake Properties, press coverage of recent acquisitions, board meeting minutes with my signature, and financial statements showing my controlling interest in the company. While you thought I was managing a modest trust fund and attending charity luncheons, I was actually running one of the largest privately held real estate companies in the Northeast, I explained, my voice steady and clear. All those afternoon meetings, those weekend conferences, the family emergency in Seattle last month, I was acquiring a competing property company, one that Meridian Development had also been pursuing. Natalie had gone completely still, the color draining from her face as the implications sank in. "You're that Emily Sullivan?" she whispered. "The very same," I confirmed. "CEO of Westlake Properties and majority owner of 27 luxury vacation resorts across North America, including Twin Pines." I turned to Robert, whose shock was giving way to a dawning comprehension that everything he thought he knew about his wife of 12 years had been only a partial truth. "Why?" he finally asked, the single word weighted with confusion and betrayal. "Why would you hide this from me for all these years?" It was a fair question, perhaps the only one he had the right to ask in this moment. At first, because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my family name or wealth, I said, memories of our early days together briefly softening my expression. When we met, I was tired of men pursuing me for what I owned rather than who I was. I paused, refilling my water glass to give myself a moment. And then, as I came to know you better, I realized how important it was to your sense of self to be the provider, the successful one. Your ego was fragile when it came to female achievement, especially financial success. Robert flinched but didn't deny it. So I compartmentalized my life. Emily Williams, supportive wife at home. Emily Sullivan, CEO in the boardroom. It seemed simpler that way. I shook my head, genuine regret flickering across my features. I see now that it was a mistake. In hiding my true self from you, I allowed you to believe a fiction, that I was somehow less than I am. And perhaps that made it easier for you to justify your betrayal. Betrayal? Robert attempted indignation, though his voice lacked conviction. "Emily, I don't know what you think is happening, but please," I interrupted, sliding my phone across the table to him. On the screen was the forwarded email chain. Your little getaway with Natalie, your comments about your frigid wife, and her trust fund. You accidentally sent me the entire thread, Robert. The restaurant had fallen completely silent, the other diners no longer pretending not to watch the drama unfolding at the center table. "It was a mistake," Robert said, desperation creeping into his voice. "A stupid, terrible mistake. Let's go somewhere private and talk about this." "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice hardening. "Like accidentally forwarding me your intimate messages to Natalie? Or were you referring to stealing $5 million from our joint accounts? Perhaps you meant the corporate espionage, feeding Westlake's confidential information to Meridian Development through your Mistress." Natalie's head snapped up. "That's not true," she protested weakly. "Robert told me he was a silent investor in Westlake, that the information was his to share." "And you never thought to verify that?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Before passing confidential information to a competitor?" She fell silent, the calculation behind her eyes shifting to something closer to fear as she realized the potential legal implications of her actions. "There's been a misunderstanding," Robert attempted, though his usual smooth confidence had abandoned him. "I can explain everything." "I'm sure you can," I agreed. "You've always been good with words, Robert. Good at spinning stories, creating narratives, making people believe what's convenient for you to have them believe." I nodded to Sandra. "You convinced your sister that your parents meant for you to have their entire estate, despite clear documentation." "To the contrary." "That's a family matter," Robert said tightly. "It became my family when you married me," I countered. "Just as it became my business when you started using company assets to fund your affair." "Company assets?" Robert repeated, confusion evident in his furrowed brow. "Twin Pines Resort," I clarified. "The cabin you're staying in. The romantic getaway you planned with your mistress is actually one of my properties. One of many you sought to damage through your corporate espionage with Meridian." I signaled to Marcus again, who approached with a leather portfolio, which he placed before me. I opened it, revealing a stack of legal documents. These are divorce papers, I explained, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. Given the circumstances and the extensive prenuptial agreement you signed, you'll find the terms rather ungenerous. Robert stared at the papers, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Your personal and business accounts have been frozen pending investigation into financial fraud, I continued. The offshore holdings have been identified and are being repatriated. Sandra has already filed a separate lawsuit regarding the inheritance you stole from her. And Natalie? Robert asked, a hint of his old calculation returning as he sought any possible leverage. Ms. Carson faces her own consequences, I replied. The evidence of corporate espionage has been turned over to the relevant authorities. Meridian Development is already under investigation by the SEC, and Victor Meridian is cooperating fully to save himself. I turned to Natalie. In exchange for testimony against Robert and Victor, you may be offered a deal. I suggest you contact an attorney immediately. She nodded, all pretense abandoned. I will. As for your firm, Robert, I continued, the board of directors has been informed of your actions. Given that Westlake is a major client, accounting for nearly 30% of your annual revenue, I imagine they'll be conducting their own internal investigation. The main course arrived, perfectly prepared local trout with seasonal vegetables that no one at our table touched. You've destroyed everything, Robert said, his voice hollow. My career, my reputation. No, Robert, I corrected him gently. You destroyed everything with every lie, every betrayal, every document you passed to Natalie, and every dollar you hid offshore. I'm simply making the consequences of those choices public. I reached into the portfolio and removed one final document, placing it before him. What's this? He asked warily. The deed to Cabin 7, I said. I thought you should know that the romantic getaway you planned with your mistress is actually one of my properties, one of many you sought to damage through your actions. Closed the portfolio and stood, smoothing my dress with deliberate calmness. I think we've disrupted this lovely restaurant enough for one evening. I nodded to our fellow diners, who had been silent witnesses to the entire exchange. My sincere apologies for involving you in our personal drama. Please enjoy the rest of your meal with my compliments. I turned back to Robert and Natalie. You'll find your belongings have been moved to standard rooms in the main lodge. Security will escort you. Your flights back to Boston have been arranged for tomorrow morning. Emily, wait! Robert pleaded, standing as well. Please, there must be some way to fix this. I paused, looking at the man I had shared my life with for 12 years. There isn't, Robert. Some betrayals can't be undone. I slipped my wedding ring from my finger and placed it on the table before him. Enjoy the rest of your dinner. The wine is particularly good, about $800 a bottle. Perhaps the last expensive vintage you'll be enjoying for quite some time. With that, I turned and walked away, Sandra at my side, feeling the weight of every eye in the restaurant on my back. But for the first time in years, I wasn't playing a role or hiding my true self. I was Emily Sullivan, in full possession of my power, my identity, and my future. And it felt absolutely right. Sandra and I walked in companionable silence through the resort's lush gardens, following a winding path illuminated by tasteful landscape lighting. The night air was cool and fragrant with pine and wildflowers, a stark contrast to the heated confrontation we'd just left behind. That, Sandra said finally, breaking the silence, was the most satisfying thing I've ever witnessed. Her voice held a combination of admiration and lingering anger. I've spent 10 years fantasizing about confronting Robert, and you managed to dismantle him in a single dinner. I laughed softly, surprised by how genuine the sound felt. It did go rather well, didn't it? Well? She shook her head in disbelief. It was masterful. The timing, the evidence, the witnesses. I'm impressed and slightly terrified. We reached my cabin, and I gestured for her to enter. The staff had prepared the space beautifully in our absence. Subtle lighting, a bottle of brandy with 2 snifters on the coffee table, a small fire crackling in the stone fireplace despite the mild evening. "Make yourself comfortable," I said, moving to pour us each a measure of the amber liquid. "And please don't be terrified. I save that side of myself for people who truly deserve it." Sandra accepted the brandy with a nod of thanks and settled into one of the armchairs facing the fireplace, her posture relaxing slightly for the first time since I'd met her. She studied me over the rim of her glass. How much of what happened back there was planned, and how much was improvisation? I joined her, sinking into the adjacent chair with a sigh of relief. Now that the adrenaline was fading, I could feel the tension of the past days finally beginning to ease. The broad strokes were planned, I admitted, swirling the brandy to release its aroma. The venue, your arrival, the evidence. But some elements evolved naturally. Natalie's reaction, for instance. I expected more denial. "She's pragmatic," Sandra observed. Once she realized the game was up, she immediately started calculating her options. "Yes, that makes her dangerous even now," I agreed. "We'll need to be vigilant in the coming weeks." We sipped our brandy in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in our own thoughts. The fire popped and crackled, sending dancing shadows across the wood-paneled walls. "What will happen to them?" Sandra asked finally, her voice softer than before. "Legally?" I considered the question. "Robert will face charges for financial fraud at minimum, possibly corporate espionage as well. The evidence is overwhelming. Natalie will likely make a deal to testify against him and Victor. Meridian. She'll avoid jail time, but her professional reputation is finished." "And personally?" Sandra pressed. "For you, I mean." I gazed into the amber depths of my brandy, searching for the right words. "Divorce, obviously. A fresh start." I shrugged. Slightly. "Beyond that, I haven't thought that far ahead. The past week has been consumed with planning this confrontation." "You loved him once," Sandra said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes," I acknowledged quietly. "Very much. Or at least I loved who I thought he was." I took another sip of brandy, feeling its warmth spread through me. The man I saw tonight, calculating, materialistic, willing to sacrifice even family for financial gain. That's not the Robert I married. Or perhaps it is, Sandra suggested gently. "And you simply refuse to see it." I nodded, understanding perfectly. We all have blind spots when it comes to those we love. "I idolized Robert when we were younger," Sandra confessed, staring into the fire. "My brilliant big brother who could do no wrong. It took his betrayal for me to see him clearly." "When did you first suspect?" I asked. "About the inheritance, I mean." Sandra's expression darkened. "Almost immediately. The terms of the will never made sense. Our parents were scrupulously fair in everything. The idea that they would leave everything to Robert and nothing to me was absurd." She sighed, old pain evident in the gesture. But I was in Arizona, grieving, disconnected from our family lawyers. By the time I started asking questions, Robert had liquidated most of the assets and integrated them into his business. The legal battle seemed insurmountable. "And yet you persisted, for 10 years. "Not continuously," she clarified. "There were periods when I gave up, tried to move on with my life. But it always came back to this sense of incompletion. Injustice." She met my eyes directly. I needed the truth to be acknowledged, even if I never recovered a penny. I raised my glass in a toast. "To persistence, then, and to justice, however long it takes." Sandra clinked her glass against mine. "To justice." We drank, and I felt a connection forming between us. Two women who had been wronged by the same man, now allied in the aftermath of his exposure. "What about you?" I asked after a moment. "What happens to Sandra Williams after this?" She looked thoughtful, considering the question seriously. "Legally, I'll work with your team to recover what I can of my inheritance." She traced the rim of her glass with one finger. "Beyond that, back to Arizona, I suppose. I've built a life there, a good one, despite Robert's best efforts." "What do you do in Arizona?" "I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in desert ecosystems," she replied, a hint of pride entering her voice. "I work with conservation groups to protect endangered species while balancing the needs of local communities." I smiled, genuinely interested. "That sounds fascinating, and far more meaningful than shuffling investment portfolios, if you don't mind my saying so." "It is," she agreed warmly. "And while the money would have been very nice 15 years ago, when I was struggling to finish my doctorate, I've made peace with building my life from scratch." She gave me a sidelong glance. "Unlike some, I don't measure success in dollars." "A refreshing perspective," I said, raising my glass again, "and one I share, despite appearances." I gestured to the luxury surrounding us. "Westlake is my family's legacy, and I take my stewardship of it seriously. But the money itself, the trappings of wealth—" I shook my head slightly. "It's not what drives me." "What does drive you, Emily Sullivan?" Sandra asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. I considered the question seriously, perhaps more seriously than I had in years. "Purpose," I said finally. "The knowledge that what I'm building will outlast me, will provide for thousands of families. We create something of value in the world." I smiled ruefully. Terribly earnest, I know. "Not at all," Sandra countered. "It's refreshingly honest, and explains why my brother's betrayal cut so deep." "Yes," I acknowledged quietly. It wasn't just the affair, humiliating as that was. It was the corporate espionage, the willingness to undermine something I've dedicated my life to building and protecting. That was the true betrayal. We fell silent again, each processing the evening's events in our own way. The brandy was warm in my chest, soothing some of the rawness that the confrontation had left behind. After a while, I found myself speaking again, voicing thoughts I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. I keep thinking about all the years I spent hiding who I was from Robert. The constant compartmentalization, the white lies about where I was going and what I was doing, all to protect his ego, to maintain this fiction that he was the successful one, the provider. "That must have been exhausting," Sandra observed. "It was, and unnecessary as it turns out, because no amount of self-diminishment on my part could feed the black hole of his insecurity. He still sought validation elsewhere, from Natalie, from his fraudulent business successes, from the lifestyle he projected." I shook my head, a mixture of regret and dawning clarity washing over me. I compromised myself for nothing. That's perhaps the bitterest pill to swallow. Sandra considered this, swirling the last of her brandy thoughtfully. "Not for nothing," she said finally. "You've learned something invaluable about yourself, about what you're willing to accept in a relationship. That seems worth something." I smiled, appreciating her perspective. "You're right, of course. And there's a certain freedom in having everything exposed, all the secrets laid bare. I don't have to pretend anymore. Not with Robert, not with anyone." "Freedom?" Sandra echoed, raising her glass. "I'll drink to that." As we clinked glasses again, my phone buzzed with an incoming message from Marcus. R and N have returned to their new accommodations. Security reports he's making calls. Lawyers, presumably. She's packing. Separate rooms, separate activities. The partnership appears to be dissolving rapidly. I showed the message to Sandra, who laughed softly. Rats leaving a sinking ship. How predictable. Indeed, I agreed. Though I suspect Natalie will land on her feet. She's resourceful, if nothing else. And Robert? What becomes of him when the dust settles? I considered this, trying to project the most likely outcome of the legal proceedings that were now in motion. Best case scenario for him? A plea deal, minimal jail time, significant financial penalties. Worst case? Federal prison for financial fraud and corporate espionage. I took a final sip of my brandy. Either way, his reputation is destroyed, his firm will collapse, and his lifestyle is over. Do you feel vindicated? Sandra asked, carefully, studying my face in the firelight. I took a moment to examine my own emotions, to identify exactly what I was feeling in the aftermath of Robert's public humiliation. It wasn't triumph exactly, nor was it the vicious satisfaction I might have expected. Not vindicated? I said slowly. Resolved, perhaps, as though a chapter that needed to end has finally closed. I traced the rim of my empty glass. There's sadness there, certainly. 12 years of my life invested in a relationship built on half-truths and compromise. But also relief, a sense that I can move forward now, wholly myself, without the constant strain of pretending to be less than I am. Sandra nodded, understanding in her eyes. Resolved. Yes, that's it exactly. Not victory, not vengeance, just completion. We sat in companionable silence after that, the fire slowly dying to embers as the night deepened around us. Eventually, Sandra stood, stretching slightly. I should go. It's been a long day, and tomorrow promises to be eventful in its own way. I rose as well, walking her to the door. Where are you staying? Marcus arranged a cabin for me at the far end of the property, she replied. As far from Robert's new accommodations as possible, she added with a slight smile. Good. And your plans? How long will you remain at Twin Pines? My flight back to Arizona is scheduled for Sunday, she said. Unless? She hesitated, then continued with a touch of uncertainty. Unless you think I should stay longer? For the legal proceedings, I mean. I shook my head. No need. My team will coordinate everything with you remotely. Your statement has already been recorded, and the documentation you provided is more than sufficient for the initial filings. At the door, Sandra turned to face me, her expression serious. Thank you, Emily, for believing me when I reached out, for giving me the chance to finally confront Robert for, she gestured vaguely, all of this. I smiled, genuinely warmed by her gratitude. It was my pleasure, truly, and I hope this isn't the end of our association. Despite the unfortunate circumstances, I've enjoyed meeting you. Likewise, she said, returning my smile. Perhaps when the dust settles, when all the legal matters are resolved. I'd like that, I said sincerely. My work takes me to Arizona occasionally. We could have dinner under considerably less dramatic circumstances. I'd like that, too. She hesitated, then added softly, He didn't deserve either of us, you know. Not your loyalty, not my admiration. He never did. No, I agreed, a weight lifting from my shoulders as I accepted the truth of her words. He didn't. But that's his loss, not ours. After Sandra departed, I returned to the deck, the night air cool against my skin. The lake stretched before me, a vast mirror reflecting the stars and moon, the mountains a darker presence beyond. In the distance, I could see the lights of the main lodge where Robert and Natalie were now staying in separate rooms. Their romantic getaway transformed into something far different than they had planned. Everything was in motion now. The legal consequences, the professional repercussions, the personal humiliation. There was no going back, no way to undo what had been set in motion tonight. Yet as I stood there watching the moonlight on the water, I found my thoughts turning not to the past, but to the future. To the woman I could be now, without the constraints I had placed on myself for Robert's benefit. To the life I would build, the authentic relationships I might form, the freedom to be fully and unapologetically myself in every aspect of my existence. For the first time since discovering Robert's betrayal, I felt a sense of genuine optimism about what lay ahead. Not because of what I had taken from him, but because of what I had reclaimed for myself. My identity, my power, my truth. It was, I realized with a small smile, a rather magnificent form of liberation. 3 months later, I stood on the deck of the executive cabin at Twin Pines, watching the sunrise over the lake. The early morning mist was rising from the water, creating an ethereal landscape of light and shadow. In the distance, I could see the construction crew already at work on the new community center, a project I'd initiated to provide educational opportunities and job training for local residents. The divorce had been finalized with surprising speed, Robert's legal team recognizing the futility of fighting given the overwhelming evidence against him. The legal proceedings against Robert moved faster than anyone anticipated. He had pled guilty to lesser charges of financial fraud to avoid the more serious consequences of corporate espionage, receiving a 5-year sentence with the possibility of parole after 3 years, plus substantial fines and restitution payments. His once thriving marketing firm had collapsed almost overnight when news of his arrest became public, clients fleeing like passengers from a sinking ship. I watched the autumn leaves drift across the lawn of my Boston home, sipping coffee on the terrace and reflecting on how much had changed in the 6 months since that fateful night at Twin Pines. The property no longer felt like ours. I had redecorated, replacing the sleek modern furniture Robert had preferred with warmer, more comfortable pieces that reflected my personal taste rather than the image we had cultivated as a power couple. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Jessica, my assistant at Westlake Properties. "Good morning, Emily. The board meeting is set for 10, and I've sent the quarterly reports to your email." Also, Sandra called. She said her flight arrives at 3, and she'll take a car directly to your house if that still works. "Perfect," I replied. "Tell Marcus I'll call him after the board meeting to discuss the Twin Pines expansion and have flowers sent to Sandra's guest room, please." Sandra's visit was something I had been looking forward to. After our dramatic first meeting, we had stayed in touch, gradually building a genuine friendship that transcended our connection through Robert. She had been instrumental in developing Westlake's new sustainability initiative, which we were preparing to unveil at our annual investors meeting next month. As I headed inside to prepare for my video conference with the board, I paused to look at a photograph that now held pride of place on my mantle. A candid shot of me with the Twin Pines staff, taken at the groundbreaking ceremony for the community center. My smile in that photo was genuine, my posture relaxed, my eyes bright with purpose. It was the face of a woman who no longer felt the need to diminish herself for anyone's comfort. The board meeting went smoothly, with unanimous approval for our third-quarter financial projections and enthusiastic support for the expansion of our community investment programs. These initiatives had been my passion project since the divorce, transforming Westlake from a traditional real estate development company focused solely on luxury properties to one that balanced profit with purpose, creating economic opportunities in the communities where we operated. The Twin Pines Community Center has already enrolled 60 local residents in its vocational training programs, I reported to the board members on my screen. Early indicators suggest we'll see a significant return on this investment through increased local hiring, reduced turnover, and strengthened community relations. We're proposing similar centers at our Aspen and Nantucket properties. Margaret Chen, our newest board member and a respected economist, nodded approvingly. "The numbers support your vision, Emily. This isn't just good public relations, it's sound business strategy for long-term growth." After the meeting concluded, I called Marcus at Twin Pines to discuss the expansion plans. The resort had become something of a second home to me since the divorce, a place where I felt truly comfortable being myself. Under Marcus's management, It had also become Westlake's flagship property, with occupancy rates up 20% and guest satisfaction scores at an all-time high. The architectural plans for the new cabins arrived yesterday, Marcus reported. They've incorporated all the sustainable design elements you requested while maintaining the rustic luxury aesthetic our guests expect. Excellent. And the staff? Housing renovations? On schedule and within budget. The team is particularly excited about the childcare facility. 3 employees have already enrolled their children for when it opens next month. I smiled, remembering how skeptical some of the executives had been when I first proposed investing in quality housing and services for our resort staff. It's all interconnected, I had argued. When our employees are secure and supported, that translates directly to guest experience. The early results were proving me right. Staff turnover had dropped dramatically, and the quality of service had improved noticeably. The resort industry had always operated on a model that treated workers as disposable. We were demonstrating there was a better way. After finalizing the details with Marcus, I spent the afternoon in my home office, reviewing the legal documents related to Sandra's inheritance case. The courts had ruled in her favor, ordering Robert to return the misappropriated assets with interest. Between the criminal penalties, civil judgments, and divorce settlement, Robert's financial ruin was complete. I felt no satisfaction in this, just a grim recognition that justice had been served. I was just closing my laptop when I heard a car in the driveway. A glance at the security monitor showed Sandra emerging from a town car, her expression brightening as she looked up at the house. I went to greet her, genuinely happy to see the woman who had become not just an ally, but a valued friend. "This place looks different," she observed as I gave her a tour of the renovated living room. "Warmer. More like you." That was the goal. I agreed. No more designing my home to impress Robert's clients or maintain some artificial image. Sandra nodded, understanding immediately. Living authentically. It suits you. She ran her hand along the back of a comfortable armchair. I like this version of Emily Sullivan much better than the carefully curated Mrs. Williams I first met. So do I admitted with a laugh. Though I'm still getting to know her myself, it's strange how easy it is to lose yourself in someone else's expectations. Over dinner that evening, a casual meal we prepared together rather than the formal, catered affairs Robert had always insisted upon for guests, Sandra shared updates about her conservation work in Arizona. Her foundation, partially funded by her recovered inheritance, was making significant progress in protecting endangered desert species while creating sustainable economic opportunities for local communities. "The parallels to your work with Westlake are striking," she noted as we moved to the living room with glasses of wine. "We're both trying to prove that profit and purpose aren't mutually exclusive." "It's about reimagining success," I agreed, settling into a deep armchair. For so long, I measured it the way Robert did, by acquisition, by growth for its own sake, by outward appearances. Now I'm asking more fundamental questions. What are we building? Who benefits? What's the legacy we're creating? "Speaking of legacy," Sandra said, her expression growing more serious, "have you heard from Natalie?" I shook my head. "Not directly. My attorney mentioned she testified at Robert's sentencing hearing, painting herself as another victim of his manipulation. Apparently, she's working at a small marketing firm in Chicago now, keeping a low profile." "And you? Any personal developments?" Sandra asked carefully, not wanting to pry but genuinely interested in my well-being. I considered the question, appreciating her concern. "I've been on a few dates," I admitted. "Nothing serious yet. I'm enjoying the process of rediscovering who I am outside of a relationship." I smiled ruefully. "It turns out I'm more interesting than I gave myself credit for." "I could have told you that," Sandra said with a warm laugh. "From the moment you orchestrated that spectacular takedown at Twin Pines, I knew you were someone extraordinary." That wasn't exactly my finest moment, I said, though I couldn't help smiling at the memory. Effective, certainly, but perhaps a bit theatrical. It was exactly what it needed to be, Sandra countered firmly. You gave Robert the opportunity to face consequences in a setting that matched the magnitude of his betrayal. There's a certain poetry in that. We talked late into the night, discussing everything from business strategies to favorite books, to childhood memories. It struck me how different this friendship was from the carefully calibrated social relationships I had maintained as Robert's wife. There was no performance here, no calculated networking, just genuine connection. The next morning, over breakfast on the terrace, Sandra brought up the sustainability conference where she was scheduled to speak. The organizers were hoping you might consider giving the keynote address, she said casually, though I could tell, from her expression, that she strongly supported the idea. Your perspective on transforming Westlake would be incredibly valuable. I hesitated, stirring my coffee. I've always avoided public speaking. Robert was the face of his company. I was comfortable staying behind the scenes at Westlake. But that was the old Emily, Sandra pointed out gently. The one who dimmed her light for Robert's comfort. Is that still who you want to be? Her question hit home. Was I still holding myself back out of habit? Or worse, was I still defining myself in relation to Robert, even in his absence? You're right, I said, making a decision. Tell the organizers I'd be honored to deliver the keynote. Sandra's face lit up. Wonderful. They'll be thrilled, and so am I. It's time the world heard directly from Emily Sullivan. That afternoon, we drove to the Westlake offices in downtown Boston, where I had arranged for Sandra to meet with our environmental impact team. The company headquarters occupied 3 floors of a historic building that had been retrofitted with cutting-edge sustainable technology, a physical embodiment of how we were blending tradition with innovation. As we walked through the open, light-filled space, I introduced Sandra to key team members, watching with pride as she engaged them in detailed discussions about her conservation work. This was the world I had kept hidden from Robert for so many years, afraid that my success might somehow diminish his. Now I could share it openly, without apology or minimization. Your team is impressive, Sandra remarked as we headed to the conference room for her presentation. They clearly respect you enormously. They're the heart of Westlake, I replied. I'm just fortunate to work with people who share the vision. That's not how most CEOs would describe it, Sandra observed, with a knowing smile. You lead differently than Robert would have. That's not a criticism, it's a compliment. Her comment stayed with me throughout the afternoon meeting, where Sandra presented her findings on sustainable development practices that could be implemented across Westlake properties. The team's enthusiastic response confirmed what I had long believed. Businesses could do well by doing good, creating value for shareholders while also contributing positively to society and the environment. After the meeting, I took Sandra to my private office, a corner space with large windows overlooking the Boston skyline. Unlike the intimidating executive suites many CEOs favored, I had designed my office to be welcoming and accessible, with comfortable seating arranged for conversation rather than confrontation. This is exactly what I would have expected from you, Sandra said, taking in the space. Professional, but approachable, like its occupant. I smiled, pleased by her assessment. It took me a while to figure out my own leadership style. For years, I emulated what I saw around me, mostly men who led through dominance and control. It never felt right, but I thought that's what success looked like. And now? Now I understand that authentic leadership comes from being true to your own values, not imitating someone else's. My strength isn't in intimidation, it's in building connections, seeing possibilities others miss, bringing together diverse perspectives to create something greater than the sum of its parts. That's a rare gift, Sandra said seriously, and it's why Westlake is thriving under your guidance. As we prepared to leave the office, Jessica appeared at the door. "Emily, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you should see." She handed me a tablet open to a financial news site. The headline made my breath catch. "Meridian Development Files for Bankruptcy Amid SEC Investigation." I quickly scanned the article, which detailed how the company had collapsed following the revelation of its corporate espionage activities against Westlake. Victor Meridian, the CEO, was facing criminal charges, and the company's assets were being liquidated to satisfy creditors. This was the competitor Natalie was feeding information to? Sandra asked, reading over my shoulder. I nodded, a complex mix of emotions washing over me. Victor had been trying to acquire Westlake properties for years, legally at first, then through increasing levels of deception when that didn't work. Do you feel vindicated? I considered the question carefully. Not vindicated exactly. There's no satisfaction in watching a company fail. Hundreds of innocent employees will be affected by this. I handed the tablet back to Jessica. But there is a certain rightness to it. Actions have consequences. Victor made choices that prioritized short-term gain over ethical business practices, and this is the result. Just like Robert, Sandra observed quietly. Yes, I agreed. Just like Robert. That evening, after Sandra had retired to the guest room, I found myself drawn to my study. The news about Meridian had stirred something in me. Not regret or doubt about the path I had taken, but a deeper reflection on the nature of justice and forgiveness. I opened my laptop and began to write, organizing my thoughts for the keynote address I had agreed to deliver. My fingers moved swiftly over the keys as I articulated a vision for business that went beyond profit margins and market share to embrace responsibility, to employees, to communities, to the environment. True, success, I wrote, isn't measured by what we acquire but by what we create, not by what we take from the world but by what we give back to it. The words flowed easily, authentically, reflecting values I had always held but had sometimes compromised for the sake of harmony with Robert. No more. This was my voice, my vision, my truth, and I was finally ready to share it with the world, without apology or diminishment. The next morning, I showed Sandra what I had written, suddenly nervous about her reaction. She read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. "This is powerful, Emily," she said finally. "Not just the ideas, which are compelling, but the voice. It's unmistakably you. Clear, authentic, purposeful." Relief washed over me. That's exactly what I was hoping for. "You know," Sandra said, handing the laptop back to me, "when you invited me to that dinner at Twin Pines, I expected to witness a showdown between you and Robert. What I didn't expect was to meet someone who would become a dear friend and a source of inspiration." Her words touched me deeply. "The feeling is mutual. Your courage in confronting Robert after all those years gave me strength to face my own situation. We've both come a long way since then," she observed. "We have," I agreed. "And the journey's just beginning." Later that day, after Sandra had departed for a meeting with local conservation groups, I received an unexpected call from Marcus at Twin Pines. "Emily, I apologize for bothering you, but there's a situation I thought you should know about," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "Robert Williams has requested to book a cabin at the resort next month." I blinked in surprise. "Robert, but he's in prison." "Not anymore, apparently. His legal team successfully appealed some aspect of his sentence. He's on probation, but free." A flood of emotions washed over me. Shock, anger, confusion. But beneath them, a surprising calm. 6 months ago, this news might have devastated me, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Now I found myself more curious than distressed. "Did he say why he wants to stay at Twin Pines specifically?" I asked. "There are plenty of other resorts in the area." "He didn't," Marcus replied. But he requested cabin 7, the same one where I confronted him and Natalie, I finished. Interesting. What would you like me to do? I can refuse the reservation, of course. I considered the question carefully. My first impulse was to deny Robert access to any Westlake property, to use my position to shut another door in his face. But something about that felt small, petty, a regression to the power games that had characterized our relationship. No, I decided. Accept the reservation. Are you sure? Marcus sounded concerned. After everything he did? I'm sure, I said, growing more confident in my decision. We're not in the business of turning away paying guests, even those with complicated histories. Besides, I added, Robert's actions can't hurt me anymore. That chapter of my life is closed. After ending the call with Marcus, I sat in my garden, processing this unexpected development. Robert, free and returning to Twin Pines, the scene of his greatest humiliation. What was he seeking? Closure? Redemption? Some twisted form of nostalgia? Whatever his motives, they didn't matter to me as much as my own response. The woman I had been a year ago, the one who had orchestrated an elaborate revenge against her cheating husband, was not the woman I was today. That Emily had needed to prove something, to reclaim her power through a dramatic confrontation. This Emily knew her worth without external validation. The revelation brought a sense of peace that surprised me. I had moved beyond revenge to something more meaningful, rebuilding my life on my own terms, creating a legacy that reflected my deepest values, forming relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation or control. That evening, I called Sandra to share the news. Roberts, out of prison, she repeated, clearly shocked. How is that possible? Legal technicality, apparently, I replied. His high-priced attorneys earned their fees. How do you feel about it? Honestly, I'm okay, I said, surprised to find it was true. A year ago, I was devastated by his betrayal. 6 months ago, I needed to expose him to reclaim my sense of self. Now, he just doesn't have that power over me anymore. That's significant, Emily, Sandra said thoughtfully. That's real healing. I think you're right. And the strangest part? He's booking a cabin at Twin Pines, the same one, where everything fell apart. Sandra was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Nothing, I said simply. He's a paying guest. The resort will treat him accordingly. I have no reason to communicate with him or acknowledge his presence in any way. You're not even curious about why he's going there? Of course I'm curious, I admitted, but not curious enough to re-engage with him. Whatever Robert's reasons, they're his business now, not mine. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and curled up on my favorite window seat, watching as twilight settled. Over the garden, Robert's unexpected reappearance in my peripheral vision had clarified something important. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving him of responsibility for his actions, but about freeing myself from the burden of anger and resentment. I didn't need to confront him again or understand his motives. I didn't need to prove anything to him or to myself. I had already reclaimed my identity, my power, my future. Robert was part of my past, a chapter closed, a lesson learned, a transformation catalyzed. The following week flew by in a whirlwind of activity as I prepared for the sustainability conference. Working with a speech coach, I refined my keynote, address, and practiced delivering it with confidence. The process was challenging but exhilarating, another step in embracing my authentic voice. You've got this, Olivia assured me after my final practice session. As both my PR advisor and close friend, she had witnessed my evolution from the shadow of Robert's wife to a visible leader in my own right. The content is compelling, and your delivery is natural and engaging. It still feels vulnerable, I confessed. Standing on that stage as myself, not hiding behind a corporate persona or minimizing my accomplishments. Vulnerability is strength, Olivia reminded me. It's what makes your message authentic and relatable. The day of the conference arrived, and I found myself standing backstage at the convention center, taking deep breaths as the moderator introduced me. The audience was larger than I had anticipated. Over 1,000 industry leaders, environmental, advocates, and business students filled the auditorium. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, the moderator was saying. Emily Sullivan, CEO of Westlake Properties, whose innovative approach to sustainable development is transforming the luxury resort industry. As I walked onto the stage, the spotlight momentarily blinded me. Then my vision cleared, and I saw faces looking back at me, attentive, curious, ready to listen. In that moment, the last traces of anxiety melted away, replaced by a calm certainty that I belonged exactly where I was. "Thank you for that kind introduction," I began. For many years, I believed that business success and environmental responsibility were competing interests, that we had to choose between profit and purpose. Today, I want to share how Westlake Properties is proving that's a false dichotomy. For the next 40 minutes, I spoke from the heart about our journey toward sustainability, the community initiatives we had implemented, and the measurable benefits we had seen, not just in public relations but in concrete business metrics like employee retention, operational efficiency, and customer loyalty. The old paradigm positioned sustainability as a cost center, I explained. The new paradigm recognizes it as an investment in long-term viability. At Westlake, we're not just building properties, we're building communities, economies, and opportunities that will outlast any of us in this room. As I concluded my speech, the audience rose in a standing ovation. The applause washed over me, affirming not just the content of my message but the courage it had taken to deliver it, to step fully into the spotlight as Emily Sullivan, no longer hidden behind anyone else's shadow. At the reception afterward, I was approached by investors, environmental advocates, and other business leaders, all eager to discuss potential collaborations or learn more about Westlake's approach. In each conversation, I found myself speaking with a confidence and clarity that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, when I was still calibrating my every word to maintain Robert's comfort. "Your keynote was remarkable," said a tall woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Elena Vasquez, director of a prominent sustainability institute. "But what impressed me most was how you fielded questions. You didn't just give polished corporate responses. There was genuine thoughtfulness in every answer." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched by her observation. "I've been practicing authenticity lately." She laughed warmly. "Most people practice spinning or message control. Authenticity is refreshing." She handed me her card. "I'd love to discuss how our institute might partner with Westlake on research initiatives." As the evening wound down, Sandra found me by the refreshment table. She had given her own presentation earlier in the day, discussing the ecological impact of traditional resort development and alternative approaches. "You were magnificent," she said, eyes shining with pride. "I watched the audience during your speech. They were completely engaged. You didn't just inform them, you inspired them." It felt right, I admitted. For the first time in public speaking, I wasn't trying to be someone else or meet some external standard. I was just me. "That's why it worked so powerfully," Sandra said. "Authenticity resonates in a way that performance never can." On our drive back to my home, Sandra mentioned that she had extended her stay in Boston by a few days. "If you're not too busy," she added, "I thought we might take a trip up to Twin Pines this weekend. I'd like to see the progress on the community center in person." I hesitated, remembering Marcus's call about Robert's upcoming reservation. "When exactly were you thinking of going?" "Friday through Sunday," she replied. "Is that a problem?" I relaxed slightly. According to Marcus, Robert wasn't scheduled to arrive until the following Tuesday. Not at all. I'd love to show you how the project has developed since your last visit. The prospect of returning to Twin Pines filled me with anticipation rather than anxiety. The resort had become a symbol of my transformation, the place where I had shed old limitations and embraced my authentic self. Each visit reinforced that evolution, strengthening my connection to the person I was becoming rather than the one I had left behind. Friday morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for a drive to the Catskills. Sandra and I set out early, enjoying the changing leaves and companionable conversation as we made our way north. The foliage was at its peak, painting the landscape in brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered," Sandra remarked as we approached the resort. The main lodge came into view, its stone and timber architecture blending harmoniously with the natural surroundings. Marcus greeted us at the entrance, his professional demeanor warming into a genuine smile when he saw me. "Emily, wonderful to have you back. And Ms. Williams, always a pleasure." "Please, it's Sandra," she corrected gently. "Ms. Williams still makes me look around for my mother." Marcus led us to the executive cabin, which had been prepared for our arrival with fresh flowers and a selection of local artisanal products, cheeses, preserves, and handcrafted chocolates from the small businesses Westlake had helped establish through our community development initiatives. "The staff is excited to show you the progress on the community center," Marcus mentioned as we settled. They've added some features based on feedback from local residents, a childcare space during training sessions, a small business incubator, additional computer stations. "I can't wait to see it," I replied, genuinely eager to witness how the project had evolved with input from those it was designed to serve. After a light lunch, we drove to the construction site on the edge of the resort property. What had been merely a cleared space and foundation during my last visit was now taking shape as a modern, welcoming facility. The walls were up, windows installed, and local craftspeople were working on the interior finishes. Maria Delgado, the project manager I had hired from the local community, greeted us with evident pride. "Right on schedule and under budget," she reported as she guided us through the space. "And we've already got a waiting list for the first training cohorts." "This is incredible," Sandra said, clearly impressed as Maria showed us the various spaces: classrooms, workshop areas, a commercial kitchen for culinary training, computer labs, and community gathering spaces. "The design is exceptional," noted, admiring how the building incorporated local materials and architectural elements that reflected the region's heritage while providing modern, functional spaces. "That's Elena's work," Maria said, referring to the local architect we had hired. She insisted that if we're training people to work in hospitality, the training environment should reflect the quality and attention to detail we expect in our resorts. We spent the afternoon touring the facility and meeting with some of the local residents who would be both teaching and learning there. Their enthusiasm was contagious, reinforcing my conviction that Westlake's investment in the community would yield returns far beyond the financial. As we walked back to the car, Sandra linked her arm through mine. "You know what struck me most? Everyone we met spoke about the project as ours, not Westlake's, not the community's, but something they're building together. That's remarkable." "That was always the goal," I replied. "Not charity or corporate social responsibility as a marketing strategy, but genuine partnership. Shared investment means shared commitment to success." That evening, we dined at the resort's lakeside restaurant, enjoying seasonal cuisine prepared with ingredients from local farms and producers. The atmosphere was relaxed yet elegant, with large windows showcasing the moonlight on the lake and a stone fireplace providing warmth against the autumn chill. "To transformation," Sandra proposed, raising her glass in a toast. "Of places, of businesses, of ourselves." "To transformation," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. and to unexpected friendships born from unlikely circumstances. We lingered over dinner, discussing everything from the sustainability conference to Sandra's latest research to books we had recently enjoyed. It struck me how comfortable our friendship had become, how easily we moved between serious topics and lighthearted banter, professional collaboration, and personal connection. As we were finishing dessert, I noticed a disturbance near the restaurant entrance. Marcus was speaking quietly but intensely with someone just out of my view, his posture suggesting concern. I was about to look away, not wanting to intrude on what appeared to be a private matter, when the other person shifted position. My breath caught. It was Robert. He looked thinner than when I had last seen him, his once immaculate appearance now showing signs of strain. His hair had more gray than I remembered, and his posture lacked the confident bearing that had once been his trademark. But it was unmistakably him, standing in the restaurant where 6 months earlier I had exposed his betrayal and reclaimed my identity. Sandra followed my gaze, her expression hardening when she recognized Robert. "What is he doing here? I thought he wasn't scheduled to arrive until next week." "So did I murmured, watching as Marcus firmly but politely directed Robert away from the restaurant entrance. From their body language, I gathered that Marcus was explaining that the restaurant was fully booked for the evening, a gracious way of preventing an uncomfortable encounter. "Do you want to leave?" Sandra asked, her concern evident. "We could have coffee sent to the cabin instead." I considered the question carefully, assessing my own emotional response to Robert's unexpected appearance. To my surprise, I felt no anxiety, no resurgence of pain or anger, just a mild curiosity mixed with a strange sense of detachment, as if observing a character from a story I had read long ago. "No," I decided, turning back to Sandra. "I'm not going to alter my plans because Robert changed his. This is my resort, my life, my evening with a friend. He doesn't get to disrupt that." Sandra studied my face, then nodded approvingly. "You really have moved on, haven't you?" "I have," I confirmed, realizing the full truth of it as I spoke. "Whatever Robert's reasons for being here, they don't concern me anymore. My focus is on the future, on building something meaningful, not on reliving the past." As if to demonstrate this commitment, I turned the conversation back to the community center, discussing plans for its official opening the following month. By the time we finished our coffee, Robert was no longer at the forefront of my thoughts. The next morning dawned with a crystalline clarity that only seems to exist in the mountains. I stood on the deck of the executive cabin, warming my hands around a mug of coffee, as I watched the mist rise from the lake's surface. Despite Robert's unexpected early arrival at Twin Pines, I had slept soundly, a testament to how much healing had occurred in the month since our confrontation. Sandra joined me on the deck, wrapped in one of the cabin's plush robes. "It's otherworldly out here at this hour," she observed, accepting the cup of coffee I offered her. "I can see why you're drawn to this place." "It's always been special to me," I agreed, "even before. Everything. There's a sense of perspective here that's hard to find elsewhere." We stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching a pair of herons glide across the water. Finally, Sandra broached the subject we'd both been avoiding since the previous evening. "What do you want to do about Robert? Should we adjust our plans for today?" I took a thoughtful sip of my coffee. "No adjustments necessary. I have meetings scheduled with the local artisans who are creating pieces for the community center, then lunch with Maria to discuss staffing. I won't alter those commitments because Robert decided to show up early. And if you encounter him?" "Then I'll be polite and professional," I said simply. "He's a guest at a resort I own. Nothing more, nothing less." Sandra studied my face, then nodded with approval. "You've really found your center, Emily. A year ago. A year ago, I would have either hidden in this cabin or orchestrated another dramatic confrontation," I finished for her. "Neither," response would serve any purpose now. After breakfast, we drove to the small town near Twin Pines, where I had meetings scheduled with local craftspeople. The first was with Elena Ramirez, whose family had been woodworkers in the Catskills for generations. She was creating custom furniture for the community center, pieces that honored traditional techniques while incorporating modern, sustainable materials. Elena's workshop was a converted barn filled with the rich scent of cedar and maple. Samples of her work displayed an organic elegance that perfectly complemented the natural beauty of Twin Pines. "These are extraordinary," Sandra murmured, running her hand along the silky finish of a conference table made from reclaimed barnwood. "Elena is an artist," I agreed. "That's why we commissioned her for the community center. We wanted the space to showcase local talent while providing functional, beautiful furnishings." As we continued our day, visiting other artisans and discussing plans for the community center, I felt a profound sense of purpose. The pain that had initially driven me to Twin Pines had transformed into something constructive, a vision for sustainable development that honored local traditions while creating new opportunities. Our lunch was scheduled at a small farm-to-table restaurant on the edge of Twin Pines property. As we wrapped up our meeting with Maria Delgado, the project manager, I noticed Maria's expression change, her eyes focusing on something over my shoulder. I turned to see Robert standing at the restaurant entrance, waiting to be seated. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away, his face showing a flicker of discomfort. "Would you prefer to leave through the kitchen?" Maria asked quietly, having been briefed by Marcus about the situation. "No need," I replied, gathering my things with unhurried composure. "We've finished our business here." As we passed Robert on our way out, I acknowledged him with a polite nod, the same courtesy I would extend to any guest at the resort. He seemed momentarily taken aback by my calm demeanor, perhaps expecting either hostility or distress. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Robert," I replied evenly. "I hope you're enjoying your stay at Twin Pines." Without waiting for his response, I continued toward the door, Sandra at my side. Outside in the autumn sunshine, she gave my arm a supportive squeeze. "That was impressive," she said. Dignified without being cold, polite without being personal. "It felt right," I admitted. "Not a performance or a strategy, just an authentic response to the situation." That evening, I received a text from Marcus. "R has requested a meeting with you tomorrow. Said it's important. How would you like me to respond?" I showed the message to Sandra, who frowned. "What do you think he wants?" "I have no idea," I admitted. "Closure? Forgiveness? To explain himself?" I set the phone down, considering my options. "Whatever it is, I'm not sure it matters to me anymore." "You don't owe him your time," Sandra pointed out. "I don't," I agreed. "But refusing to meet might give the impression that I'm still affected by what happened, that I'm avoiding him out of hurt or anger." "And you're not?" I shook my head slowly, realizing the truth as I spoke it. "No, I'm not. What Robert did was devastating at the time, but it led me to where I am now. More authentic, more purposeful, more aligned with my true values than I've ever been." I picked up my phone and typed a response. "I can spare 30 minutes tomorrow at 10 a.m. in my office at the main lodge. Business topics only." The following morning, I dressed with particular care, not to impress Robert, but to reinforce my own sense of confidence and authority. The Sullivan signet ring went on my right hand, a subtle reminder of who I was and the legacy I represented. At precisely 10 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Marcus ushered Robert in, his expression neutral but watchful. Robert looked distinctly uncomfortable as he took the seat I indicated across from my desk. The confident bearing that had once been his defining characteristic was notably diminished. "Emily," he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words now that he had secured the meeting he'd requested. "You wanted to see me," I prompted, my tone neither warm nor cold, simply professional. "How can I help you?" He shifted in his seat. "This isn't easy for me. Being back here, seeing you again after everything that happened." "I imagine not," I acknowledged. "Though I'm curious why you chose to return to Twin Pines specifically." "I needed to face it," he said finally. "This place, what happened? Here, who I was when I was here last." He glanced up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "Who I was throughout our marriage." "I see. The thing is," he continued, "prison gives you a lot of time to think about your choices, your mistakes, the person you've become." He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't like what I saw, Emily. Not at all." "Self-reflection can be uncomfortable," I observed, still maintaining professional distance. "But I'm not clear on why you wanted to meet with me to share these insights." "I wanted to apologize," he said finally. "Not to ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. I know that's not possible. But to acknowledge the harm I caused you." I studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was something different in his demeanor now, a humility that seemed genuine, a lack of the calculated charm he had once wielded so effectively. Robert reached into his pocket and removed a small USB drive, which he placed on the desk between us. "This contains information about Victor Meridian and his company's attempts to acquire Westlake properties through both legal and illegal means. Details that weren't covered in the investigation or trial." "Why would you have this information?" "Because I was more involved than you know," he admitted, his expression grim. "Not just passing along information that Natalie extracted from you, but actively participating in strategy sessions with Victor. There were plans I was aware of that never came to light during the investigation." "Why are you sharing this now?" Robert met my gaze directly. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because despite everything, I don't want to see your work undermined by the same schemes I once participated in. Because making amends isn't just about saying sorry, it's about taking concrete actions to repair harm where possible." His answer surprised me with its apparent sincerity. The Robert I had known would have leveraged such information for personal gain, not offered it freely as restitution. "I'll have our security team review this," I said, finally picking up the drive. "If the information proves valuable, I appreciate you bringing it forward." As he turned to leave, a question occurred to me. "Robert," I called, causing him to pause at the door. "Why Cabin 7 specifically? You must have known the memories it would evoke." He considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I needed to face the worst of myself to find a way forward. That cabin is where my carefully constructed facade finally crumbled, where I couldn't hide from the truth of who I'd become." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Poetic justice that it's the most uncomfortable place I've ever stayed, despite all its luxury." With that, he departed, leaving me alone with a complex mixture of emotions I hadn't anticipated feeling. Not regret or lingering attachment, but something more nuanced. A recognition that human beings, even those who have caused profound harm, contain multitudes and possibilities for change. Later that afternoon, I rejoined Sandra for a tour of local farms that supplied the resort's restaurants. We visited an apple orchard where heritage varieties were being preserved, a small dairy producing artisanal cheeses, and a cooperative greenhouse where former coal miners were learning hydroponic growing techniques. "This is what healing looks like on a community scale," Sandra observed, as we watched workers harvest lettuce that would be served at Twin Pines that evening, creating new possibilities from past wounds. "That's a profound observation," I replied, struck by how perfectly it applied to both the economic transition these workers were experiencing and my own personal journey. That evening, our last at Twin Pines before returning to Boston, we dined at the main lodge's restaurant. As it happened, Robert wasn't there. Marcus mentioned discreetly that he had checked out that afternoon, leaving a note thanking the staff for their professionalism during his stay. The next morning, as we prepared to depart, I took one last walk alone to the spot where I had confronted Robert and Natalie 6 months earlier. The private dock extending from Cabin 7 was empty now, the Adirondack chairs stacked for the approaching winter season. But the view remained spectacular. Mountains reflected in clear water, trees ablaze. With autumn color, the sky an impossible blue, as I turned to leave, I noticed something caught in the wooden slats of the dock, a small piece of paper fluttering in the gentle breeze. Curious, I knelt to retrieve it, discovering it was a resort note card with my name written on the outside, in a familiar hand. For a moment, I considered throwing it into the lake without reading it, maintaining the clean break I had established. But curiosity won out. I unfolded the note to find just 3 lines in Robert's distinctive handwriting. Emily. May you find someone who sees and appreciates the remarkable woman you always were, even when I was too blind to recognize her. I refolded the note and slipped it into my pocket, not as a keepsake to revisit and analyze, but as the final period at the end of a chapter now complete. Then I walked back toward the main lodge, where Sandra was waiting with our packed belongings, ready for the drive back to Boston and whatever adventures lay ahead. 3 months later, I stood at the podium during the grand opening of the Twin Pines Community Center. The building was filled with local residents, Westlake employees, government officials, and media representatives, all gathered to celebrate a project that represented a new approach to corporate responsibility and community development. This center isn't just a building, I told the audience, my voice strong and clear. It's a testament to what we can achieve when we view success not just in terms of profit margins, but in terms of human potential and community well-being. As I spoke, I caught Sandra's eye in the front row. She gave me an encouraging nod, her pride evident. Beside her sat Elena Ramirez and other local artisans whose work had transformed the center into a showcase of regional talent and sustainable design. After the ceremony, as guests explored the facility and enjoyed refreshments prepared by the first cohort of culinary students, a reporter approached me for an interview. Ms. Sullivan, many people are calling this project revolutionary in terms of corporate community partnerships. What inspired your vision? I considered the question carefully, aware of the complex journey that had led me to this moment. Sometimes, I replied, our greatest opportunities for growth come from our most painful challenges. This center was born from my own process of rediscovering what truly matters: authentic connection, purposeful work, and the courage to live according to our deepest values rather than external expectations. The reporter seemed surprised by my candor. That's unusually personal for a CEO. I smiled, no longer feeling the need to compartmentalize my professional and personal selves. Perhaps that's part of the revolution, recognizing that leadership is most effective when it's authentic and fully human. Later, as Sandra and I walked the grounds of the center, watching families explore the gardens and community spaces we had created, she linked her arm through mine. You've built something extraordinary here, Emily. Not just this center, but a whole new way of being in the world. We've built something extraordinary, I corrected her, acknowledging her crucial role in both the project and my personal transformation. And we're just getting started. As the sun began to set over the mountains, casting the lake in shades of gold and amber, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. For every painful revelation, every difficult choice, every step toward a more authentic life. What had begun as a devastating betrayal had ultimately led to liberation, not just from a marriage built on half-truths and compromise, but from the limitations I had placed on myself. In losing what I thought I wanted, I had found what I truly needed: the courage to live with purpose, integrity, and wholehearted engagement in creating a life and legacy of meaning. And as I looked out over the community gathering, people of all ages and backgrounds connecting, learning, growing together. I knew that the best chapters of my story were still waiting to be written. The next morning dawned with a crystalline clarity that only seems to exist in the mountains. I stood on the deck of the executive cabin, warming my hands around a mug of coffee as I watched the mist rise from the lake's surface. Despite Robert's unexpected early arrival at Twin Pines, I had slept soundly, a testament to how much healing had occurred in the months since our confrontation. Sandra joined me on the deck, wrapped in one of the cabin's plush robes. "It's otherworldly out here at this hour," she observed, accepting the cup of coffee I offered her. "I can see why you're drawn to this place." "It's always been special to me," I agreed. "Even before. Everything. There's a sense of perspective here that's hard to find elsewhere." We stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching a pair of herons glide across the water. Finally, Sandra broached the subject we'd both been avoiding since the previous evening. "What do you want to do about Robert? Should we adjust our plans for today?" I took a thoughtful sip of my coffee. "No adjustments necessary. I have meetings scheduled with the local artisans who are creating pieces for the community center, then lunch with Maria to discuss staffing. I won't alter those commitments because Robert decided to show up early. And if you encounter him, then I'll be polite and professional," I said simply. "He's a guest at a resort I own. Nothing more, nothing less." Sandra studied my face, then nodded with approval. "You've really found your center, Emily. A year ago, I would have either hidden in this cabin or orchestrated another dramatic confrontation," I finished for her. Neither response would serve any purpose now. After breakfast, we drove to the small town near Twin Pines, where I had meetings scheduled with local craftspeople. The first was with Elena Ramirez, whose family had been woodworkers in the Catskills for generations. She was creating custom furniture for the community center, pieces that honored traditional techniques while incorporating modern, sustainable materials. Elena's workshop was a converted barn filled with the rich scent of cedar and maple. Samples of her work displayed an organic elegance that perfectly complemented the natural beauty of Twin Pines. "These are extraordinary," Sandra murmured, running her hand along the silky finish of a conference table made from reclaimed barnwood. "Elena is an artist," I agreed. "That's why we commissioned her for the community center. We wanted the space to showcase local talent while providing functional, beautiful furnishings." As we continued our day, visiting other artisans and discussing plans for the community center, I felt a profound sense of purpose. The pain that had initially driven me to Twin Pines had transformed into something constructive, a vision for sustainable development that honored local traditions while creating new opportunities. Our lunch was scheduled at a small farm-to-table restaurant on the edge of Twin Pines property. As we wrapped up our meeting with Maria Delgado, the project manager, I noticed Maria's expression change, her eyes focusing on something over my shoulder. I turned to see Robert standing at the restaurant entrance, waiting to be seated. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away, his face showing a flicker of discomfort. "Would you prefer to leave through the kitchen?" Maria asked quietly, having been briefed by Marcus about the situation. "No need," I replied, gathering my things with unhurried composure. "We've finished our business here." As we passed Robert on our way out, I acknowledged him with a polite nod, the same courtesy I would extend to any guest at the resort. He seemed momentarily taken aback by my calm demeanor, perhaps expecting either hostility or distress. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Robert," I replied evenly. "I hope you're enjoying your stay at Twin Pines." Without waiting for his response, I continued toward the door, Sandra at my side. Outside in the autumn sunshine, she gave my arm a supportive squeeze. "That was impressive," she said. Dignified without being cold, polite without being personal. "It felt right," I admitted. "Not a performance or a strategy, just an authentic response to the situation. That evening, I received a text from Marcus. R has requested a meeting with you tomorrow. Said it's important. How would you like me to respond? I showed the message to Sandra, who frowned. What do you think he wants? I have no idea, I admitted. Closure? Forgiveness? To explain himself? I set the phone down, considering my options. Whatever it is, I'm not sure it matters to me anymore. You don't owe him your time, Sandra pointed out. I don't, I agreed. But refusing to meet might give the impression that I'm still affected by what happened, that I'm avoiding him out of hurt or anger. And you're not? I shook my head slowly, realizing the truth as I spoke it. No, I'm not. What Robert did was devastating at the time, but it led me to where I am now, more authentic, more purposeful, more aligned with my true values than I've ever been. I picked up my phone and typed a response. I can spare 30 minutes tomorrow at 10 a.m. in my office at the main lodge. Business topics only. The following morning, I dressed with particular care, not to impress Robert, but to reinforce my own sense of confidence and authority. The Sullivan signet ring went on my right hand, a subtle reminder of who I was and the legacy I represented. At precisely 10 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Marcus ushered Robert in, his expression neutral but watchful. Robert looked distinctly uncomfortable as he took the seat I indicated across from my desk. The confident bearing that had once been his defining characteristic was notably diminished. Emily, he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words now that he had secured the meeting he'd requested. You wanted to see me, I prompted, my tone neither warm nor cold, simply professional. How can I help you? He shifted in his seat. This isn't easy for me. Being back here, seeing you again after everything that happened. I imagine not, I acknowledged, though I'm curious why you chose to return to Twin Pines specifically. I needed to face it, he said finally. This place? What happened? Here? Who I was when I was here last? He glanced up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. Who I was throughout our marriage. I see. The thing is, he continued, prison gives you a lot of time to think about your choices, your mistakes, the person you've become. He ran a hand through his hair. I didn't like what I saw, Emily. Not at all. Self-reflection can be uncomfortable, I observed, still maintaining professional distance. But I'm not clear on why you wanted to meet with me to share these insights. I wanted to apologize, he said finally. Not to ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. I know that's not possible, but to acknowledge the harm I caused you. I studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was something different in his demeanor now. A humility that seemed genuine, a lack of the calculated charm he had once wielded so effectively. Robert reached into his pocket and removed a small USB drive, which he placed on the desk between us. This contains information about Victor Meridian and his company's attempts to acquire Westlake properties through both legal and illegal means. Details that weren't covered in the investigation or trial. Why would you have this information? Because I was more involved than you know, he admitted, his expression grim. Not just passing along information that Natalie extracted from you, but actively participating in strategy sessions with Victor. There were plans I was aware of that never came to light during the investigation. Why are you sharing this now? Robert met my gaze directly. Because it's the right thing to do. Because despite everything, I don't want to see your work undermined by the same schemes I once participated in. Because making amends isn't just about saying sorry. It's about taking concrete actions to repair harm where possible. His answer surprised me with its apparent sincerity. The Robert I had known would have leveraged such information for personal gain, not offered it freely as restitution. "I'll have our security team review this," I said, finally picking up the drive. "If the information proves valuable, I appreciate you bringing it forward." As he turned to leave, a question occurred to me. "Robert," I called, causing him to pause at the door. "Why Cabin 7 specifically? You must have known the memories it would evoke." He considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I needed to face the worst of myself to find a way forward. That cabin is where my carefully constructed facade finally crumbled, where I couldn't hide from the truth of who I'd become." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Poetic justice that it's the most uncomfortable place I've ever stayed, despite all its luxury." With that, he departed, leaving me alone with a complex mixture of emotions I hadn't anticipated feeling. Not regret or lingering attachment, but something more nuanced. A recognition that human beings, even those who have caused profound harm, contain multitudes and possibilities for change. Later that afternoon, I rejoined Sandra for a tour of local farms that supplied the resort's restaurants. We visited an apple orchard where heritage varieties were being preserved, a small dairy producing artisanal cheeses, and a cooperative greenhouse where former coal miners were learning hydroponic growing techniques. This is what healing looks like on a community scale, Sandra observed as we watched workers harvest lettuce that would be served at Twin Pines that evening, creating new possibilities from past wounds. "That's a profound observation," I replied, struck by how perfectly it applied to both the economic transition these workers were experiencing and my own personal journey. That evening, our last at Twin Pines before returning to Boston, we dined at the main lodge's restaurant. As it happened, Robert wasn't there. Marcus mentioned discreetly that he had checked out that afternoon, leaving a note thanking the staff for their professionalism during his stay. The next morning, as we prepared to depart, I took one last walk alone to the spot where I had confronted Robert and Natalie 6 months earlier. The private dock extending from Cabin 7 was empty now, the Adirondack chairs stacked for the approaching winter season. But the view remained spectacular. Mountains reflected in clear water, trees ablaze, with autumn color, the sky an impossible blue. As I turned to leave, I noticed something caught in the wooden slats of the dock, a small piece of paper fluttering in the gentle breeze. Curious, I knelt to retrieve it, discovering it was a resort note card with my name written on the outside, in a familiar hand. For a moment, I considered throwing it into the lake without reading it, maintaining the clean break I had established. But curiosity won out. I unfolded the note to find just 3 lines in Robert's distinctive handwriting. "Emily, may you find someone who sees and appreciates the remarkable woman you always were, even when I was too blind to recognize her." I refolded the note and slipped it into my pocket, not as a keepsake to revisit and analyze, but as the final period at the end of a chapter now complete. Then I walked back toward the main lodge, where Sandra was waiting with our packed belongings, ready for the drive back to Boston and whatever adventures lay ahead. 3 months later, I stood at the podium during the grand opening of the Twin Pines Community Center. The building was filled with local residents, Westlake employees, government officials, and media representatives, all gathered to celebrate a project that represented a new approach to corporate responsibility and community development. "This center isn't just a building," I told the audience, my voice strong and clear. "It's a testament to what we can achieve when we view success not just in terms of profit margins, but in terms of human potential and community well-being." As I spoke, I caught Sandra's eye in the front row. She gave me an encouraging nod, her pride evident. Beside her sat Elena Ramirez and other local artisans whose work had transformed the center into a showcase of regional talent and sustainable design. After the ceremony, as guests explored the facility and enjoyed refreshments prepared by the first cohort of culinary students, a reporter approached me for an interview. "Ms. Sullivan, many people are calling this project revolutionary in terms of corporate community partnerships. What inspired your vision?" I considered the question carefully, aware of the complex journey that had led me to this moment. "Sometimes," I replied, "our greatest opportunities for growth come from our most painful challenges." This center was born from my own process of rediscovering what truly matters: authentic connection, purposeful work, and the courage to live according to our deepest values rather than external expectations. The reporter seemed surprised by my candor. "That's unusually personal for a CEO." I smiled, no longer feeling the need to compartmentalize my professional and personal selves. Perhaps that's part of the revolution, recognizing that leadership is most effective when it's authentic and fully human. Later, as Sandra and I walked the grounds of the center, watching families explore the gardens and community spaces we had created, she linked her arm through mine. "You've built something extraordinary here, Emily. Not just this center, but a whole new way of being in the world." "We've built something extraordinary," I corrected her, acknowledging her crucial role in both the project and my personal transformation. "And we're just getting started." As the sun began to set over the mountains, casting the lake in shades of gold and amber, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. For every painful revelation, every difficult choice, every step toward a more authentic life. What had begun as a devastating betrayal had ultimately led to liberation, not just from a marriage built on half-truths and compromise, but from the limitations I had placed on myself. In losing what I thought I wanted, I had found what I truly needed: the courage to live with purpose, integrity, and wholehearted engagement in creating a life and legacy of meaning. 6 months after the community center opening, I found myself addressing a packed auditorium at a women's leadership conference in New York. My book, Authentic Power: Leading with Purpose and Integrity, had just hit the bestseller lists, and the audience was filled with women at various stages of their professional journeys. "The greatest obstacle to authentic leadership isn't external," I told them, making eye contact with individuals throughout the room. "It's the stories we tell ourselves about who we're supposed to be, the compromises we believe are necessary, the parts of ourselves we think we need to hide to succeed or be loved." I paused, allowing the words to resonate. I spent years compartmentalizing my life, being one person in the boardroom and another in my marriage. I thought I was protecting both worlds, but in reality, I was fragmenting myself. True power comes not from separation, but from integration, bringing your whole self to every aspect of your life. A young woman raised her hand during the Q&A session. "How did you find the courage to reclaim your authentic self after such a profound betrayal?" Her question touched on something essential. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," I replied carefully. "It's the decision that something else matters more. In my case, living a divided life had become more painful than the risk of stepping fully into who I am." After the conference, Sandra and I celebrated over dinner at a small Italian restaurant. Our friendship had deepened into a powerful alliance, with Sandra now heading Westlake's environmental initiatives and serving on the board of directors. "You've inspired so many women today," she said, raising her glass in a toast, "including me." I smiled, genuinely touched. "You know what's remarkable? A year ago, I was focused on revenge, on making Robert pay for his betrayal. Now, I barely think about him at all. My energy is directed toward creation rather than reaction." "That's the most powerful form of healing," Sandra observed. "Not just recovering from hurt, but redirecting that energy toward something meaningful." The following month brought new developments. Westlake had been approached by a consortium of investors interested in expanding our community-centered development model internationally. Their proposal would bring sustainable resort properties and community training centers to underserved regions in Southeast Asia and Central America. As I reviewed the proposal with my executive team, I realized how far we had come from the traditional luxury resort model that had once defined Westlake. We were pioneering a new approach to development, one that measured success not just in revenue but in community impact, environmental stewardship, and human potential. "This isn't just business evolution," our CFO commented during the strategy session. "It's a fundamental reimagining of what a corporation can be and do in the world." His observation struck me deeply. What had begun as my personal journey toward authenticity had catalyzed an organizational transformation with potential global impact. By allowing myself to lead from my true values rather than industry conventions, I had opened possibilities that extended far beyond myself. That evening, as I walked through the Boston Public Garden on my way home, I reflected on the path that had brought me here. The betrayal that had once seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something far more significant, a reclamation not just of my personal power, but of my vision for what business could be in the world. My phone rang. It was Eleanor Ramirez calling from Twin Pines. The community center had just graduated its first cohort of apprentices, all of whom had secured positions either at Westlake Properties or with partner businesses in the region. One of our graduates, Maria's daughter Isabella, has been accepted to design school, Elena reported excitedly. She's the first in her family to pursue higher education. The scholarship from the Westlake Foundation made it possible. As we talked, I felt a wave of emotion, not just pride in what we had accomplished, but profound gratitude for the journey that had led here. Every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to create this moment. Later that night, I sat on my terrace, looking out at the city lights and writing in my journal, a practice I had begun during the darkest days after discovering Robert's betrayal, and continued as a way to track my evolving thoughts and dreams. "True power," I wrote, "isn't about control over others or even circumstances. It's about alignment, bringing your outer actions into harmony with your inner values. It's about creating rather than acquiring, connecting rather than imposing, serving rather than dominating." I thought about the women I had spoken to at the conference, many of whom were struggling with their own versions of the dilemma I had faced. How to be authentic in a world that often rewards conformity. How to lead with integrity in systems designed for competition rather than collaboration. The answer, I was discovering, wasn't to reject traditional measures of success, but to expand them, to insist that human flourishing, environmental health, and community well-being were just as important as financial returns, not as charity or corporate social responsibility, but as fundamental to how we defined value creation itself. As spring turned to summer, I found myself returning to Twin Pines frequently, drawn to the tangible evidence of transformation taking place there. The community center was thriving, with programs at capacity and waiting lists forming for new offerings. Local businesses were growing, supported by the influx of visitors drawn to the resort's unique approach to sustainability and authentic local experiences. And I was changing too, more comfortable in my own skin, more confident in my vision, more connected to a sense of purpose larger than myself. The woman who had once carefully calibrated her every word and action to maintain a delicate balance between worlds was gone, replaced by someone both stronger and more vulnerable, both more powerful and more deeply connected. And as I looked out over the community gathering, people of all ages and backgrounds connecting, learning, growing together, I knew that the best chapters of my story were still waiting to be written. What had begun in pain had blossomed into purpose, and the journey ahead promised to be more authentic, more impactful, and more deeply satisfying than anything I could have imagined in my former life. Sometimes the greatest gift is not getting what you thought you wanted, but discovering what you truly need. My husband's betrayal had shattered the careful illusion I had constructed, and in doing so, had set me free to build something real. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.